My family had always lived in the same old house, a large Victorian place that had been passed down through generations. It was a beautiful home with tall windows, creaky wooden floors, and a sense of history in every corner. However, there was one part of the house that remained off limits: the basement. The basement had been locked ever since my grandpa's time. My father was very strict about keeping it that way. Whenever I asked about it, he would quickly change the subject or sternly tell me never to go down there. His reactions only made me more curious. One rainy afternoon, when I was home alone, I found myself staring at the locked basement door. My curiosity had been building for years, and I decided it was time to find out what was hidden down there. I rummaged through my dad's study, searching for the key. After a thorough search, I found it hidden in a drawer, buried under old papers. With trembling hands, I unlocked the door. The hinges groaned as it swung open, revealing a dark staircase leading down into the unknown. I grabbed a flashlight and started my descent, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. The basement smelled musty and the air was cold and damp. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling and dust covered every surface. As I shone the flashlight around, I saw old furniture, boxes of forgotten belongings, and shelves lined with jars filled with strange, unidentifiable objects. In the corner of the room, I noticed a large old trunk. It looked ancient with its leather straps and metal hinges. The trunk drew me in, and I felt a strange compulsion to open it. I knelt down and slowly lifted the heavy lid. Inside, I found old photographs, letters, and a few trinkets that must have belonged to my grandpa. As I sifted through the items, I came across a worn journal. The cover was cracked, and the pages were yellowed with age. I opened it and began to read. It was my grandpa's journal, detailing his life and his experiences in the house. The entries started out normal, recounting daily events and family matters. But as I read further, the tone of the journal changed. Grandpa wrote about strange occurrences in the house, particularly in the basement. He mentioned hearing whispers, seeing shadows, and feeling a presence that made the hairs on his neck stand up. The entries became more frantic, with Grandpa describing how the presence grew stronger and more malevolent over time. One of the last entries mentioned a seance that Grandpa and his friends had conducted in the basement, trying to communicate with whatever was haunting the house. They had hoped to put it to rest, but instead, they seemed to have angered it. Grandpa wrote about how the spirit had become more violent, and in a desperate attempt to protect the family, he had locked the basement and warned everyone never to open it. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I read the final words in the journal. The spirit is trapped, but not forever. It waits, and it remembers. Suddenly, I heard a soft whispering sound behind me. I turned, shining the flashlight into the darkness, but saw nothing. The whispers grew louder, and I felt a cold breath on my neck. Panic surged through me, and I bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. When my father came home, he found me pale and shaken. I confessed everything, and he sighed deeply, looking more tired and sad than angry. "I warned you for a reason," he said quietly. "That spirit, it's part of our family's dark history. Your grandpa tried to protect us, and we must respect that." We relocked the basement, and I vowed never to go down there again. The house seemed different after that day, the shadows a little darker and the nights a little colder. I learned that some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some doors should never be opened. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to a channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share the stories with your friends and family. Thanks. I had always dreamed of owning a house, and when I saw the old Victorian on Willow Street listed at a fraction of its market value, I couldn't resist. The house was beautiful despite its age, with intricate woodwork, a grand staircase, and large windows that let in plenty of light. The only downside, according to the rumors, was that it was haunted. Stories of ghostly figures in the basement and strange noises had kept the price low, but I didn't believe in ghosts. I was certain that all it needed was a little TLC to become my dream home. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time cleaning and organizing, uncovering the beauty hidden beneath years of neglect. But every time I walked past the basement door, a chill would run down my spine. It was always cold near that door, colder than any other part of the house. I shrugged it off as a draft and continued with my work. One night, while unpacking in the living room, I heard a noise from the basement. I had always dreamed of owning a house, and when I saw the old Victorian, it was a faint scratching, barely audible but unmistakable in the silent house. My heart raced, but I forced myself to be rational. It was probably just a raccoon or some other animal that had gotten inside. I grabbed a flashlight and headed down the creaky stairs. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, and the air felt thick, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. The scratching had stopped, but I could still feel a presence, an almost tangible weight pressing down on me. I swept the flashlight around the room, illuminating old furniture covered in dusty sheets, stacks of boxes and cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. There was no sign of any animal. Just as I was about to go back upstairs, I noticed something strange. One of the walls looked different, newer than the rest. Curiosity got the better of me, and I began to inspect it more closely. The wall was made of bricks that didn't match the age of the house. I tapped on it, and it sounded hollow. My mind raced with possibilities. It was a faint. Perhaps there was a hidden room or a forgotten passage. Excited and a little scared, I fetched a hammer and started chipping away at the mortar. It was hard work, but eventually, I removed enough bricks to create a small opening. The cold air that rushed out was even colder than the basement itself, and it smelled of earth and decay. I shone the flashlight inside and saw a narrow, dark corridor leading further into the depths of the house. The walls were lined with old, rotting wood, and the floor was uneven dirt. As I crawled through the opening, the flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. I felt a surge of fear but pushed on, driven by curiosity. The corridor led to a small circular room. In the center of the room was an old, iron-bound chest. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached it. The air felt even heavier here, almost oppressive. I knelt down and with trembling hands lifted the lid. Inside the chest were old photographs, letters, and a few trinkets. Perhaps they seemed to belong to a family that had lived in the house long ago. As I sifted through the items, I found a diary, its leather cover cracked with age. I opened it and began to read. The diary belonged to a woman named Eleanor, who had lived in the house in the early 1900s. Her entries started out normal, detailing her life and her love for her family. But as I read on, the entries became darker. Eleanor wrote about strange noises coming from the basement, about feeling watched, and about her growing fear for her family's safety. The last few entries were frantic, filled with terror. Eleanor wrote about a presence in the basement, something evil that wanted to harm her family. She described how her husband had bricked up the corridor to protect them, sealing whatever it was inside. Her final entry ended abruptly with a single chilling sentence, "It's here." Suddenly the flashlight went out, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled with it, trying to get it to work, but it was dead. They seemed to belong to a family. I felt a cold breath on my neck and heard a whisper, barely audible but clear. "Leave." Panic surged through me. I scrambled out of the corridor, through the hole in the wall, and up the stairs. I didn't stop running until I was outside, gasping for breath. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent. I never went back. I sold the house at a loss, unable to face whatever it was that lurked in the basement. To this day, I can still hear that whisper in my nightmares, and I know that some doors are better left unlocked. We had recently moved to the quiet town of Alderbrook, seeking peace and a fresh start. My family and I were enchanted by the charm of our new neighborhood, with its tree-lined streets and friendly neighbors. However, it wasn't long before we began to notice something strange. Every night, around midnight, we would hear eerie sounds coming from the house next door. It was a large old house, slightly run down but still holding on to its former grandeur. The sounds were faint but unmistakable, muffled cries, soft thuds, and a peculiar scraping noise that sent shivers down our spines. One particularly restless night, after yet another round of unsettling noises, I decided to speak to our neighbor, Tony, the next day. He was an elderly man, always polite but somewhat reclusive. When I approached him, he seemed reluctant to talk, but after some persuasion he agreed to explain the situation. We sat in his dimly lit living room, the air thick with an unspoken tension. Tony sighed deeply, his eyes haunted by memories as he began to recount the story. "It all started many years ago," he said in a low voice. "My wife Margaret and I bought this house shortly after we were married. We were happy here for a time, but then things began to change." Tony's eyes seemed to look through me, lost in the past. It began with small things, objects moving on their own, strange cold spots, and whispers in the night. We tried to ignore it, rationalize it, but it only got worse. One night, we heard the most horrifying scream coming from the basement. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before. He paused, his hands trembling slightly. Margaret insisted we investigate. She was brave, always braver than me. We went down into the basement, and that's when we found it. My heart pounded in my chest as I leaned in, captivated by his story. "Found what?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. There was an old, forgotten room down there, hidden behind a false wall. Inside, remains of a child, a girl no older than 10. She'd been there for decades, long before we moved in. The police were called, and an investigation was conducted, but they never found out who she was or how she ended up there. He took a deep, shaky breath. After that night, the noises became more frequent, more intense. Margaret couldn't take it. She fell into a deep depression and eventually, she took her own life. A heavy silence filled the room as Tony struggled to compose himself. "I've tried everything to put her spirit to rest," he continued, "but nothing works. The sounds you hear at night, it's her. She's trapped down there, unable to move on." I felt a cold dread settle over me as I listened to his tale. "Is there anything we can do to help?" I asked, feeling a mix of fear and compassion. Tony shook his head sadly. "I don't know. I've tried priests, mediums, everything. But maybe fresh eyes, a new perspective could make a difference." That night, I couldn't sleep. The story weighed heavily on my mind, and the sounds seemed louder, more desperate. I discussed it with my wife, and we decided to try and help Tony. The next day, we gathered some friends and made our way into his basement. The air was cold and damp, and the faint smell of decay lingered. We found the hidden room just as Mr. Tony had described. It was a small, dark space, the walls covered in ancient, peeling wallpaper. In the center lay a small, decayed bed and the remnants of old, tattered toys. We decided to conduct a simple ritual, hoping to bring some peace to the restless spirit. We lit candles, said prayers, and spoke to the spirit, asking for forgiveness and offering our help to guide her to the other side. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the temperature dropped sharply, and we heard a faint, sorrowful whisper. It was a child's voice, full of pain and longing. "Help me," it said. We continued our prayers, and slowly the atmosphere began to change. The coldness receded and a feeling of peace washed over us. The whispering stopped, and the basement felt lighter, less oppressive. That night, for the first time since we moved in, we slept peacefully. The sounds had stopped, and Tony, though still grieving, seemed relieved. A few days later, we received a letter from him, thanking us for our help. He believed that the spirit of the little girl had finally found peace, and in a way, so had he. Life in Alderbrook returned to normal, But we would never forget the haunting sounds of that old house or the tragic story of the child who had been trapped there for so long. It was a chilling reminder that some secrets buried in the past can still reach out and touch the present, seeking resolution and peace.